Section 2 of A Visit to the Holy Land. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 1 of A Visit to the Holy Land, Egypt and Italy, Part 2, by Ida L. Pfeiffer. March 26th. Last night was not a period of rest, but of noise for us travelers. Not one of us could close his eyes. Semlin is a place of considerable importance as a commercial town. Above 180 cartonweight of goods were unloaded here from our vessel, and in exchange we took on board coals, wood, and wares of various descriptions. The damaged wheel, too, had to be repaired, and everything was done with so much crashing and noise that we almost imagined the whole steamer was coming to pieces. Added to this, the cold wind drove in continually through the broken pane, and made the place a real purgatory to us. At length, at 6 o'clock in the morning, we got afloat once more. One advantage, however, resulted from this fortuitous stoppage. We had a very good view of Belgrade, a town of 20,000 inhabitants, situate opposite to Semlin. It is the first Turkish fortified city in Serbia. The aspect of Belgrade is exceedingly beautiful. The fortifications extend upwards on a rock from the Danube in the form of steps. The city itself, with its graceful minarets, lies half a mile farther inland. Here I saw the first mosques and minarets. The mosques, as far as I could observe from the steamer, are built in a circular form, not very high, and surmounted by a cupola flanked by one or two minarets, a kind of high round pillar. The loftiest among these buildings is the palace of Prince Milosh. From this point our voyage becomes very interesting, presenting a rich and varied succession of delightful landscape views. The river is hemmed in on either side by mountains, until it spreads itself forth free and unrestrained in the neighborhood of Panskova to a breadth of 800 fathoms. Panskova, on the left bank of the Danube, in the territory of Banata, is a military station. As the stoppages are only for a few moments, little opportunity is afforded of seeing the interior of the towns, or of visiting most of the places at which we touch. At such times all is hurry and confusion. Suddenly the bell rings, the planks are withdrawn, and the unlucky stranger who has loitered on board for a few moments is obliged to proceed with us to the next station. At Nusats this happened to a servant, in consequence of his carrying his master's luggage into the cabin, instead of merely throwing it down on the deck. The poor man was conveyed on to Semlin, and had to travel on foot for a day and a half to regain his home. A very pleasant journey of 2 hours from Panskova brought us to the Turkish fortress Semendria, the situation of which is truly beautiful. The numerous angles of its walls and towers, built in the Moorish style, impart to this place a peculiar charm. As a rule the Turkish fortresses are remarkable for picturesque effect. But the villages, particularly those on the Serbian shore, had the same poverty-stricken look I had frequently noticed in Galicia. Wretched clay huts, thatched with straw, lay scattered around, and far and wide not a tree or shrub appeared to rejoice the eye of the traveller or of the sojourner in these parts, under the shade of which the poor peasant might recruit his weary frame, while it would conceal from the eye of the traveller, in some degree, the poverty and nakedness of habitations, on which no feeling mind can gaze without emotions of pity. The left bank of the river belongs to Hungary, and is called the Banat. It presents an appearance somewhat less desolate. Much, however, remains to be desired, and the poverty that reigns around is here more to be wondered at, from the fact that this strip of land is so rich in the productions of nature as to obtain the name of the Garner of Hungary. On the Austrian side of the Danube sentries are posted at every 200 or 300 paces, an arrangement which has been imitated by the governments on the left bank, and is carried out to the point where the river empties itself into the Black Sea. It would, however, be erroneous to suppose that these soldiers mount guard in their uniforms. They take up their positions, for a week at a time, in their wretched, tattered garments. Frequently they are barefoot, and their huts look like stables. I entered some of these huts to view the internal arrangements. They could scarcely have been more simple. In one corner I found a hearth, in another an apology for a stove, clumsily fashioned out of clay. An unsightly hole in the wall, stopped with paper instead of glass, forms the window. The furniture is comprised in a single wooden bench. Whatever the inhabitant requires in the way of provisions he must bring with him. For this he is allowed by the government to cultivate the land. Throughout the Russian territory the soldiers at least wear uniform. Our journey becomes more and more charming. Frequently the mighty river rushes foaming and roaring past the rocks, which seem scarcely to allow it a passage. At other times it glides serenely onwards. At every turn we behold new beauties, and scarcely know on which side to turn our eager eyes. Meanwhile the ship sails swiftly on, gliding majestically through wildly romantic scenery. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon we reached Pasiez, where there is nothing to be seen but a large store of coals for the steamers and a few huts. Of the town itself nothing can be distinguished. A couple of miles below Pasiez we enjoy an imposing spectacle. It is the solitary rock Babake, rising from the midst of the waters. Together with the beautiful ruin Golumbats on the Serbian shore, it forms a magnificent view. March 27th. How unfortunate it is that all advantages are so seldom found combined! We are now travelling amid glorious scenery, which we hoped should recompense us for the manifold discomforts we have hitherto endured, but the weather is unpropitious. The driving snow sends us all into the cabin. The Danube is so fiercely agitated by the stormy wind that it rises into waves like a sea. We are suffering lamentably from cold. Unable to warm ourselves, we stand gazing ruefully at the place where the stove stood, once upon a time. At 4 o'clock we reached Drenkova without accident, but completely benumbed. We hurried into the inn built by the steamboat company, where we found capital fare, a warm room, and tolerably comfortable beds. This was the first place we had reached since leaving Pest, at which we could thoroughly warm and refresh ourselves. At Drenkova itself there is nothing to be seen but the inn just mentioned and a barrack for soldiers. We were here shown the vessel which was wrecked, with passengers on board, in 1839, in a journey up the Danube. 8 persons who happened to be in the cabin lost their lives, and only those who were on deck were saved. March 28th. Early in the morning we embarked on board the Tunt, a vessel furnished with a cabin. The bed of the Danube is here more and more hemmed in by mountains and rocks, so that in some places it is not above 80 fathoms broad, and glides with redoubled swiftness towards its goal, the Pontus Exunis, or Black Sea. On account of the falls which it is necessary to pass between Drenkova and Fetislav, the steamer must be changed for a small sailing vessel. The voyage down the stream could indeed be accomplished without danger, but the return would be attended with many difficulties. The steamers, therefore, remain behind at Drenkova, and passengers are conveyed down the river in barks, and upwards, since the accident of 1839, in good commodious carriages. Today the cold was quite as severe as it had been yesterday, so that but for the politeness of a fellow passenger, who lent me his bunda, great Hungarian fur, I should have been compelled to remain in the little cabin, and thus should have missed the most interesting points of the Danube. As it was, however, I wrapped myself from head to foot in the fur cloak, took my seat on a bench outside the cabin, and had full leisure to store my memory with a succession of lovely scenery, presenting almost the appearance of a series of lake views, which continued equally picturesque until we had almost reached Alt Orsova. A couple of miles below Drenkova, near Islis, the sailors suddenly cried, "The first fall!" I looked up in a fever of expectation. The water was rising in small waves, the stream ran somewhat faster, and a slight rushing sound was to be heard. If I had not been told that the Danube forms a waterfall here, I should certainly never have suspected it to be the case. Between Lens and Krems I did not find either the rocks or the power of the stream much more formidable. We had, however, a high tide, a circumstance which diminishes both the danger of the journey and the sublimity of the view. The numerous rocky points, peering threateningly forth at low tide, among which the steersman must pick his way with great care, were all hidden from our sight. We glided safely over them, and in about 20 minutes had left the first fall behind us. The 2 succeeding falls are less considerable. On the Austro-Wallachian side, a road extends over a distance of 14 to 16 miles, frequently strengthened with masonry, and at some points hewn out of the solid rock. In the midst of this road, on a high wall of rock, we see the celebrated Veteran Cave, one of the most impregnable points on the banks of the Danube. It is surrounded by redoubts, and is admirably calculated to command the passage of the river. This cave is said to be sufficiently spacious to contain 500 men. So far back as the time of the Romans it was already used as a point of defense for the Danube. Some 5 miles below it we notice the Trajan's tablet, hewn out of a protruding rock. On the Turco-Serbian side, the masses of rock jut out so far into the stream that there is no room left for a footway. Here the famous Trajan's Road once existed. No traces of this work remain, save that the traveler notices, for 15 or 20 miles, holes cut here and there in the rock. In these holes strong trunks of trees were fastened. These supported the planks of which the road is said to have been formed. At 11 in the forenoon we reached Alt-Orsova, the last Austrian town on the military frontier of Banata or Wallachia. We were obliged to remain here for half a day. The town has rather a pretty effect, being composed mostly of new houses. The house belonging to the steamboat company is particularly remarkable. It is not, however, devoted to the accommodation of travelers, as at Drinkova. Here, as at Pressburg and Pest, each passenger is required to pay for his night's expenses, an arrangement which I could not help finding somewhat strange, inasmuch as every passenger is made to pay twice, namely, for his place on the steamer and for his room in the inn. It was Sunday when we arrived, and I saw many people proceeding to church. The peasants are dressed tolerably neatly and well. Both men and women wear long garments of blue cloth. The women have on their heads large handkerchiefs of white linen, which hang down their backs, and on their feet stout boots. The men wear round felt hats, and sandals made of the bark of trees. March 29th. After having completely refreshed ourselves at the good inn called the Golden Stag, we this morning embarked on a new craft, the Saturnus, which is only covered in overhead, and is open on all sides. So soon as a traveler has stepped upon this vessel he is looked upon as unclean, and may not go on shore without keeping quarantine. An officer accompanied us as far as Galatz. Immediately below Alt-Orsova we entirely quit the Austrian territory. We are now brought nearer every moment to the most dangerous part of the river, the Iron Gate, called by the Turks Demirkaju. Half an hour before we reached the spot, the rushing sound of the water announced the perilous proximity. Numerous reefs of rocks here traverse the stream, and the current runs eddying among them. We passed this dangerous place in about 15 minutes. Here, at the Iron Gate, the high tide befriended us, as it did at the former falls. I found these falls, and indeed almost everything we passed, far below the anticipations I had formed from reading descriptions, frequently of great poetic beauty. I wish to represent everything as I found it, as it appeared before my eyes, without adornment indeed, but truly. After passing the Iron Gate we come to a village, in the neighborhood of which some fragments of the Trajan's Bridge can be discerned at low water. The country now becomes flatter, particularly on the left bank, where extend the immense plains of Wallachia, and the eye finds no object on which it can rest. On the right hand rise terrace-like rows of hills and mountains, and the background is bounded by the sharply defined lines of the Balkan range, rendered celebrated by the passage of the Russians in 1829. The villages, scattered thinly along the banks, become more and more miserable, They rather resemble stables for cattle than human dwellings. The beasts remain in the open fields, though the climate does not appear to be much milder than with us in Austria. For today, nearly at the beginning of April, the thermometer stood 1 degree below zero, and yesterday we had only 5 degrees of warmth, reckoning by Reamer. The expeditious and easy manner in which cattle are here declared to be free from the plague also struck me as remarkable. When the creatures are brought from an infected place to one pronounced healthy, the ship is brought to some 40 or 50 paces from the shore, and each animal is thrown into the water and driven towards the bank, where people are waiting to receive it. After this simple operation, the beasts are declared free from infectious matter. Cattle rearing seems to be here carried on to a considerable extent. Everywhere I noticed large herds of horned beasts, and many buffaloes. Numerous flocks of goats and sheep also appear. On the Saturnus we traveled at the most for 2 hours, after which we embarked, opposite the fortress of Fetislav, on board the steamer Zrierny. At 5 o'clock in the evening we passed the fortress of Vidin, opposite which we stopped, in the neighborhood of the town of Calafat. It was intended merely to land goods here, and then to proceed immediately on our voyage, but the agent was nowhere to be found, and so we poor travelers were made the victims of this carelessness, and compelled to remain here at anchor all night. March 30th. As the agent had not yet made his appearance, the captain had no choice but to leave the steward behind to watch over the goods. At 6:30 in the morning the engines were at length set in motion, and, after a very agreeable passage of 6 hours, we reached Nicopolis. All the Turkish fortresses on the Danube are situated on the right bank, mostly amid beautiful scenery. The larger towns and villages are surrounded by gardens and trees, which give them a very pleasant appearance. The interior of these towns, however, is said not to be quite so inviting as one would suppose from a distant view, for it is asserted that dirty, narrow streets, dilapidated houses, etc., offend the stranger's sight at every step. We did not land at any of these fortresses or towns. For us the right bank of the river was a forbidden paradise, so we only saw what was beautiful, and escaped being disenchanted. Rather late in the evening we cast anchor opposite a village of no note. End of Section 2.